All right, let's get started. Week 3 of How Not to Read the Bible. I was talking to the Irons a few minutes ago, and I was like, when I was driving over here tonight, 75 degrees, not a cloud in the sky, and I said, no one's coming tonight. And so thank you all for coming. Hopefully everyone else will catch up on YouTube, but it is an absolutely gorgeous day out there today. So you are all very dedicated to be here, and I thank you. So hopefully we'll learn something. Let me open us in prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, thank you for this absolutely beautiful day that you've given us. And Father, thank you for this beautiful facility that you've provided us that we can learn about you. And tonight, Lord, we ask that you would help us to understand the commands, the laws that you gave the Israelites when they were leaving Egypt and headed to the Promised Land. Father, these commands can be very difficult to understand. We just pray that you will give us knowledge and wisdom to better understand these commands tonight. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay, so it's week 3, and tonight, as I promised, this will be kind of the most, I think, lighthearted of the sessions I do, right, before we get into the really heavy stuff. So tonight we're going to talk about bizarre Old Testament verses. So the verses that you come across when you're reading through the Old Testament and you're like, what in the world? Why? Why is this here? I don't understand what this means. What does this mean? So that's what we're going to do tonight. So before we start, and this is the last week I'm going to do these welcome slides, because I figure if you haven't gotten the message after 3 weeks, you're never going to get it. So again, the lectures will make more sense. You'll get more out of these if you actually read the book. And the book is How Not to Read the Bible by Dan Kimball. And I know most of you in here do have the book and are reading it. And I've gotten good feedback on the book. Of course, the people that don't like the book probably aren't saying anything to me. So I'm sure there might be a few of them. I don't know. If you want to ask me questions about any of the material, you can email me, and I would be glad to talk to you about it. And I'll be glad to send you the slides. I mean, the slides are a review of the book. There's some slightly different things in the slides. Like when we get to slavery, I'm actually adding a lot of my own material because I didn't feel that Dan Kimball spent enough time on the slavery issue. But up until now, the slides are mostly a review of the book, so maybe you don't need the slides, but if you want them later on, just let me know. And of course, as usual, I'll speak for 30 to 45 minutes and we'll do Q&A. And tonight should be the shortest talk I've given so far. I've timed myself this week and I'm only taking 30 minutes. In the last couple weeks, I've been taking 40 to 45 minutes. But I also tend to ad-lib a lot, so you never know. I might go beyond 30 minutes. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, and this will be fun, is every culture has strange laws that outsiders think are crazy. So people pick on the Bible, right? They read these things in the Bible and they're like, oh, look how strange these verses are. Look how weird these verses are, how can this be the Word of God? How do these verses make any sense? But if you go look at any culture, any nation, you will find all kinds of weird, strange laws on the books that modern people look at and read and go, where did this come from? So I just wanted to give you a few examples from the good old United States of America. So here's one I enjoy. In Alaska, in Juneau, flamingo owners are prohibited from bringing their pet into a barber shop. That is an actual law in Juneau, Alaska. And what I like is how specific it is, right? It's in a barber shop, and it's flamingos only are illegal. So you can bring other pets, I guess, into the barber shop, and you can take your flamingos in other parts of town, but don't take your flamingo into a barber shop. In Indiana, it is against the law to catch a fish with your bare hands. This is an actual law. So you can catch a fish with a rod and reel, with a net, with a spear, but if you catch a fish with your bare hands, the sheriff can arrest you in Indiana. That is an actual law in Indiana. I have no idea why. Here's a good one. In Alabama, bear wrestling matches are prohibited. Now, I don't know if this is humans versus bears or two bears being pitted against each other. I'm not really sure. But in any case, it is against the law in Alabama. Bear wrestling is against the law in Alabama. B-A-R-E. Could be. It's possible. South Dakota, it is illegal to fall asleep in a cheese factory. So if you're working in a cheese factory and you fall asleep, not only can you get fired, you can get arrested and taken to jail, because it's actually against the law to fall asleep in a cheese factory. Okay, so now I'm going to get to a couple of examples that were used in the book, which I thought were great, really entertaining. So here's the first one. The donkey sleeping in the bathtub. So in Arizona, it is illegal for a donkey to sleep in a bathtub. That is an actual law that's on the books. Now in this case, we know why, or we think we know why this law is on the books. So let's see, why is it illegal for a donkey to sleep in a bathtub? So evidently this law was put into effect in 1924. And the story is that a rancher had a donkey that frequently slept in an abandoned bathtub on the rancher's property. One day, a local dam broke, and the water from the reservoir washed the bathtub and the donkey into a basin. Local authorities were called to help rescue the donkey, but it was not easy to do. It required a lot of effort and manpower to rescue the animals. So to prevent a thing like this from ever happening again, they passed a law that prohibited donkeys from sleeping in bathtubs. So, I mean, once you know why this law was passed, it kind of makes sense, right? Because the rancher asked the town to rescue the donkey, right? And so the town had to spend a lot of money and resources to save the donkey, right? They had to spend a lot of money. They had to use a lot of manpower. And so the town's like, we can't afford this. We can't afford to spend this kind of money. And so it completely makes sense to me why they would have passed this law, given the limited resources of this town. But when you just read this law and you don't know the backstory, right, it sounds completely crazy. Like, what possible reason could there be for this law? But once you know the background, it actually kind of makes sense. Here's another one. Ice cream in your back pocket. So in Kentucky, it is illegal to carry ice cream in your back pocket. And the reason for this, again, makes total sense once you know why this law was passed. So the law against carrying ice cream in your pocket was originally passed to prevent horse theft. At the time it was passed, if you carried an ice cream cone in your pocket and walked by a horse, the horse might follow you because horses like sweet things. So the horse would leave its owner and end up belonging to someone else. So a law was passed to ban ice cream cones in pockets as a way of preventing horse theft. And again, this sounds crazy to us, but it made sense at the time because evidently this was going on. This was a thing in Kentucky. So apparently having ice cream in your back pocket could make you a horse thief. So these are just a couple of examples of laws that we read and we think are crazy and make no sense. But when you get the background, they actually do make sense. So now what we're going to do is look at some of these laws from the Old Testament and see if we can maybe figure out where some of these laws came from. Okay, if you've ever read the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, especially Leviticus, although there are some strange laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy as well, those books tend to have most of the strange laws that confuse people when they read the Bible. And before we talk about specific laws, we need to talk about the background, right? What is going on in the biblical storyline in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy? Because as we've talked about for the past 2 weeks, you have to know the context, right? You have to know where in the storyline we are, and we have to understand the historical context before we can figure out how to interpret these verses. So that's what we're going to do now, is talk about some of that background, which is critical to do before you can understand the individual examples. So we're going to talk about where in the storyline are these laws given to Israel. So these books are part of the first 5 books in the Bible, which is often called the Pentateuch, or the Jews call it the Torah. So they're part of those books, and those books were originated around 1400 BC, somewhere in there. So that's almost 3,500 years ago. So a very, very long time ago. They were written to the Israelites after they were rescued from Egyptian slavery. That's very important to keep in mind, right? We have the Israelites were in Egypt. God brings them out of Egypt. And as they are traveling toward the Promised Land is when Moses is first communicating these laws to the people of Israel. So the timing of that is extremely important before you interpret these verses. So, as God was leading Israel out of Egypt into the new land, they encountered the surrounding people groups who worshiped other gods and practiced all kinds of evil things, degrading sexual rights, family members serving in prostitution, and offerings of child sacrifice. This is what the people of Canaan were doing. The Canaanite is just sort of a term used to name all the people that lived in this land that Israel was entering, but they're actually not a homogeneous nation of people, right? There's a whole list of different nations and groups of people that live there. But Canaanite is just the word we use so we don't have to list the 20 different people groups that are living there. So God did not want Israel to become like the other nations. So he had Moses write down loving guidelines and restrictions to keep them separate and distinct from other nations. God did not want the Israelites to pattern their lives after the people who worshiped and followed different gods. God wanted them to be holy and distinct from the people groups who lived around them. The word holy means set apart, separated, and kept away from the evil and false worship of the neighboring nations. God was concerned that they would too easily be influenced by the surrounding people groups and turn away from Him to worship and follow other gods. So let me camp out here a minute and talk about this. So imagine the situation of the biblical storyline. In Genesis 11, God disinherits all the people of the earth after the Tower of Babel. God disinherits everyone. And he turns over all of the different people groups basically to members of his divine council, divine assembly, which are angelic beings. He turns the nations over to these angelic beings who rebel against God. And so those are who become the false gods. So a lot of times we forget, Christians forget that these false gods, in some cases, are real beings, right? These are angelic/demonic beings. They really exist. And God turned all of the nations over to these beings who are in rebellion against God. And so, you know, we sometimes make fun of the Israelites or these people and say, oh, well, they're just worshiping hunks of wood or gold or statues or whatever. And actually some of the prophets make fun of these people groups and say you're just worshiping a statue or whatever. But there were actual angelic beings behind these gods. Not all of them. Obviously human beings are also good at manufacturing gods themselves. But there was a real rebellion that had happened in Genesis 11. So God is starting over with mankind, and he chooses Abraham to start over. He says, I'm going to choose this people group, Abraham and his family, and I'm going to work through them to redeem humankind. So that's where God starts. Remember, that was Act 3. That's where God starts the project to save mankind through Abraham. So Israel is descended from Abraham, and so Israel is going to become the vehicle that God uses to save mankind. And obviously Jesus, the Messiah, is going to come from the line of Abraham, the line of Israel. He's going to be a descendant of these people. So you have this small group of people who have left Egypt, and they've been immersed in Egyptian culture, Egyptian religious practices for centuries. And now they're going to move out into the Promised Land where there's all these other people groups that'll be surrounding them. And the Israelites are going to easily fall prey to basically religious peer pressure when they get there. I mean, they're completely surrounded by these groups that are in clear rebellion against God. And so God is very concerned to keep the Israelites separated from these groups because he knows what will happen. In fact, the Bible very, amazingly and honestly and candidly reports Israel's failure to keep themselves separate from these people. Right? That's the whole. Well, it starts happening in the Pentateuch, but then it really gets going in the book of Joshua, and then in the book of Judges, and so forth and so on, as we talked about in Act 3, right? Israel rebels against God over and over again. So God's trying to keep the Israelites out of the influence of the religious practices of these people. Now, this is hard for us to imagine as modern, we're in 2021, and we're not polytheistic. Most of us don't have little statues and altars in our house. Most of us are not worshiping our ancestors. We're not worshiping local gods, etc. I mean, that does go on in other parts of the world, just not here. But this was the ancient world. Everybody worshipped multiple gods. Everybody. It was just part of your life. The gods were responsible for providing food, for the crops, for the weather, for keeping disease away, for giving you military victory, and on and on. The gods were responsible for all of that. And so people every single day were performing religious acts, worshiping, praying, doing all sorts of rituals to appease the gods that they were worshiping. So it's not like today. It's completely different. You have to put yourself in the mindset of these people groups. Their religion was not a thing they did on Sunday. You know, like us, we come to church on Sunday and we're done with religion for the week. That is not how it was back then. Religion was part of your everyday life for everybody. There were almost no atheists back then. Everybody believed in the gods. Everybody worshiped the gods. And so Yahweh is going to have to move these Israelite people into this land with all of these foreign gods being worshipped and foreign worship practices taking place, and somehow prevent them from taking hold of these religious practices, right? It sounds impossible. And as you know from the biblical story, it is impossible. The Israelites fail time and again, but there's always a remnant of Israelites who worship Yahweh correctly. So I just wanted to explain that because I think in our modern minds, we don't see this God worship, this ancestor worship here in America. If you go to India or parts of Asia, there's still plenty of ancestor worship. There's still plenty of people with altars in their house worshiping individual gods that are patrons of your family. I mean, this still goes on all throughout India and parts of Asia. But here we don't really see that, so it's hard for us to imagine why is God so concerned about the Israelites moving into the land of Canaan? That's why. Hopefully I didn't. It is. So Lem asked about religion and government. The state, the king of a nation, was thought of as the divine representative, the representative of the God of that nation. So the government was all about the cult meaning the rituals practiced to worship the God. So the government was dedicated to appeasing the gods, the people were dedicated to appeasing the gods. So it was a full-out onslaught. When the Israelites got into Canaan, they were going to have to deal with all of this. Okay, so with that background, let's look at some strange laws in these books. And here's the first one. Linen and wool. No. We talked about this last week, Nate. Nate admitted he quite possibly had a polyester cotton blend on his shirt. And I begged him not to wear that this week. I'm sure I think we're 100% cotton now. But in the Old Testament, it specifically says, do not combine two fabrics. Do not combine linen and wool. So here's the verses. Deuteronomy 22, verses 9 through 11. Do not plant two kinds of seed in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. Do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together, and do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. So there's this repeated theme over and over of don't mix things together. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to focus on the clothing and offer some ideas. Well, these are Dan Kimball's ideas. They're not even Dan Kimball's ideas, right? The way scholars figure out what these verses mean is they're reading documents and archaeological finds from ancient Mesopotamia from 2000, 3000 BC, and Egyptian archaeology and literary sources, again from 1000, 2000, 3000 BC from that time period. every year scholars keep finding more and more and more material from this time period. And so that's why we keep getting more insight as the years go by. And actually, a seminary professor that I respect said to me, he's like, I know this is disheartening to Christians, but they really need to buy a new commentary like at least every 10 years because the research is constantly advancing. And if your commentaries are from 20, 30, 40 years ago, the people who wrote those commentaries are not aware of a lot of the archaeological findings that have been made in the last 30 years. And it's not like the commentaries are like totally wrong. It's just that they're not going to have some of the insights that the newer commentaries would have. In fact, one guy I heard said, you shouldn't own a Bible that was translated before like 1995 because there have been so many new manuscripts found of the New Testament up to that point that there were a lot of changes made to the translations after 1995. So he's like, if you want the most accurate translation, you really should have something that's after 1995, 2000 and beyond. Again, there's not like major doctrines are changing, so I don't want to exaggerate here. But there are some nuances and some details that change. All right, so what about this mixing of crops and fabrics? Well, if you study the practices of the surrounding people groups, the Canaanite groups, they would intentionally mix two things together as part of their worship. Some scholars believe that the Canaanites, who were living in the land at that time, had a magical practice of wedding two different seeds together to have offspring in an attempt to conjure up fertile crops. So the mixing of two seeds was seen as a fertility ritual, again, to appease the gods so that they would provide fertile crops. There is a strong likelihood that the prohibitions against mixing different kinds of seeds, animals, and materials together were designed to discourage and prevent the Israelites from imitating the fertility cult practices of the Canaanites. So if you have the Canaanites mixing things together in order to perform religious rituals, mostly based on getting better crops, fertility, and so forth, then God is saying to the Israelites, I don't want you doing that. There's a lot of things the Israelites have in common with the people of the ancient world. For example, everyone did animal sacrifices. Like everybody. The Israelites didn't make that up. Everybody was doing animal sacrifices. Everybody had temples. The Israelites were not the first ones to come up with the concept of a tabernacle or a temple. Everybody else was doing that too. People would build altars on mountains. The Israelites did that. I mean, you can go on and on and on. There's all sorts of things that the Israelites shared in common with these Mesopotamian cultures of this time. But God was perfectly okay with that. But there were certain things that were specific to these other religions that God said, no. You guys do not need to do that. You need to be different and distinct in this area. Because if you compromise on these things, then you're going to adopt the religious practices of the Canaanites, which will ultimately lead you to disaster. There's another alternative explanation which was offered in the book, which I thought was interesting. And that was, it turns out that the Israelite priests would wear wool and linen garments. And so the thinking is that they didn't want the people of Israel wearing wool and linen because that was reserved for the priests. The priests were supposed to wear wool and linen. And the priests, obviously, are Levites, and they have special roles in the tabernacle, in the temple. And the analogy he used in the book is today it's illegal to wear a police uniform. You can't you're not allowed to go procure a police uniform and impersonate a police officer. That's illegal for obvious reasons, right? It's very dangerous if someone thinks you're a police officer and you're not. Well, likewise, God wanted to show the Israelites that being a priest, because the priests, remember, were the ones that were performing the sacrifices for Yahweh, right? So they had an extremely important role in Israel. And perhaps this law about mixing fabrics had something to do with God saying, this is for the priests only. I don't want the rest of you doing this. At the end of the day, we're not entirely sure, right, what the reason is. So these are, I would say, educated guesses made by scholars who have done a lot of research, but there is no certainty here. They could make a discovery next year, find some new documents that shed some more light on this. But for now, these are the best ideas that they have about why you can't mix two fabrics. Yes. Yes. Yeah, so Mike mentioned do not be unequally yoked. And I think that may connect to that. I think that verse also has to do with the fact that empirically we know when a husband, a believer marries an unbeliever, it generally doesn't work out. I mean, I see this all the time. I see someone who's a strong Christian believer and they marry whoever, someone who's an unbeliever. And almost inevitably, it doesn't go well, empirically. It just doesn't. And so I think God was very wise when he gave that command. But you're right, the mixing, definitely there's a lot of symbolism there, and it could have to do with that. That's a good point. Okay, shrimp. I love me some shrimp. But according to the Bible, I'm not allowed to eat it. At least if I was an ancient Israelite, I'm not allowed to eat shrimp. Here are the verses in case you don't believe me. This is Leviticus 11, 9 through 11. These you may eat of all that are in the waters. Everything in the waters that has fins and scales, so in other words, fish, you can eat. Whether in the seas or in the rivers you may eat, but anything in the seas or the rivers that does not have fins or scales, of the swarming creatures in the waters and of the living creatures that are in the waters, is detestable to you. You shall regard them as detestable. You shall not eat any of their flesh, and you shall detest their carcasses. So, I just use shrimp as an example because shrimp would be prohibited under these verses. You cannot eat shrimp because shrimp do not have fins and scales. Shrimp are not fish. So, online, on the internet, you see all kinds of people making fun of Christians saying, see, you guys pick and choose in the New Testament, right? It says don't eat shrimp, but every Christians all eat shrimp. Maybe Seventh-day Adventists don't eat shrimp. Seventh-day Adventists are very confused about how to apply the Old Testament to the New Testament, which is why we're going to spend a whole session, not on Seventh-day Adventists, but next week we'll be talking about, well, how do we know how to apply the Old Testament laws? Like, you're explaining what they mean, but you're not telling us how they apply. So we're going to cover that next week. But this is very strange, right? Don't eat shrimp. Or don't eat anything in the ocean that's, doesn't have fins or scales. Now, one possible rationale for these foods being restricted is just for health reasons. If you read, there's a lot of laws about hygiene and disease control and all sorts of things in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy that's just solid health advice. I mean, in the Bible, there's a lot of good health advice in there. And that could be one reason, because this was a pre-scientific era, and God may have been protecting his people from potential sickness and harm As we know today, shrimp are filter feeders prone to containing live bacteria if eaten uncooked. So that's one possibility. The same is true for pork and several other meats. If you don't cook them well, you can get pretty sick. So that's one possibility. But most likely the restrictions were about more than just healthy living. Most scholars agree that God gave the dietary laws, of which this would be part of the dietary laws, to reinforce the same concept we discussed before, which is keeping the Israelite people distinct and separate from other people groups. Now, if you think about it, food is pretty fundamental to the culture, to any culture, right? What people eat distinguishes them from other people. And so I think with these dietary laws, God sees what the surrounding Canaanites are eating in particular, and He's also seeing the foods that they use in their different religious practices, and He's carving some of these out and saying, you cannot eat these. Because you're going to be, it's just, there's too much temptation. If you eat these foods, you're going to be tempted to follow these religious practices that these people have. Food is pretty fundamental to religious practice. And so God's concerned that He doesn't want the Israelites to take on these eating practices. So He's carving out a specific diet for the Israelites so that they will not be tempted and they will be distinct from these other groups that are surrounding them. Oh, look, baby goats. Does anybody here own goats? No? I have a friend of mine that has goats, and they kind of look like that. Real cute. So, we have one of the craziest verses in the Bible, I think. I mean, this verse is so bizarre. I remember in seminary, Norm Geisler was teaching a class, and for some reason he got to this verse, and he's like, I have no idea what this means. Well, he's like, I know what it means, but I don't understand why it's in the Bible. I have no idea. And so I was thinking, I thought he was like the smartest guy I've ever met. I'm like, well, if he doesn't know, nobody knows. But that was like 15 years ago. And so there's been a lot of research done into Canaanite culture. And so we have some possible ideas. Just wanted to add the girl going, what in the world? Why would they talk about boiling a goat, a baby goat? So there's one theory that this could be referring to a Canaanite custom of boiling a kid goat, a baby goat, in its mother's milk as a worship ritual. So there is some suggestion in some ancient documents that this was done as a part of Canaanite worship ritual. So it was something like a lucky fertility charm. The people believed that boiling the baby goat in its mother's milk would appease their gods and give them bountiful growth for their livestock. To participate in a Canaanite fertility worship ritual would be to violate God's holiness and invoke other gods. Again, right? So hopefully you're seeing a pattern here. There's a Canaanite religious ritual that involves boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk, and God is circumscribing that and saying, no, Israelites, you cannot do this. And also, to be honest, this is just kind of disgusting, right, in multiple dimensions, right? I mean, the baby goat is given life by its mother's milk, and to boil the goat in its mother's milk is pretty twisted. And so it may be God was just saying, look, the Canaanites are doing this, and for several obvious reasons, you're not to do this. This is just wrong in multiple ways. So we don't know for sure why this is in the Bible, but it probably has something to do, again, with Canaanite fertility worship or worship rituals. Yes. Yeah, I mean, if we were alive back then, right, and we were Israelites, and we saw this law, and we knew that this kind of thing was going on all around us, right, we would think, oh, makes perfect sense. And it's just that we're so detached from that civilization that when we read these things, and I mean, you could use that way of thinking. I mean, imagine all the things that people 1,000 years from now are going to read back from our time and have no idea what the heck was going on and not understand it at all, right? So if you just think about that, this was 3,500 years ago. It's not surprising to me that we read these things and we think there can't be any explanation for this, but there clearly was. So the next one is the pig and the football. And according to the Bible, you cannot eat pig, you cannot touch a pig. And in the book, it talks about a TV show which says Christians and Jews should not even touch a football because it's pig skin. So let's talk about this. Here's the verse, Leviticus 11:7-8. And the pig, because it parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, but does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. You shall not eat any of their flesh, and you shall not touch their carcasses. They are unclean to you. During that time period, surrounding people groups consumed pigs for food. We know that from archaeology. Pigs were also part of the rituals of these religions and closely tied to their gods of the netherworld. So, we're going to talk about this more in a few weeks, but this is a pre-scientific time. So the people living back then, they believed that the earth was land, flat land, and that you had this sky, and at the top of the sky is a dome, a hard dome, covering the earth. And there's water above that dome. And then heaven, or where the gods live, is above that water. Below, they believed that there's basically a world of the dead. So a physical place that's below the earth's surface where the dead lived. And they believed that there were gods that were trapped down there and who ruled the world of the dead, right? In the Old Testament, it's called Sheol. That was the Jews' name for that world of the dead. And so in these Canaanite religions, pigs evidently were part of some of the religious rituals that were used to appease the gods of the world of the dead. Underneath. Because, you bury people, right? And when you think about their view of the universe, it makes complete sense, right? They're just observing. They know that when it rains, rain's coming down from the sky, and so the obvious reason is, well, there must be windows or doors in the dome above us that lets water in. I mean, totally makes sense, right? And they also know that when they dig into the ground, they hit water. That's how they get wells. So they thought that the land was sitting on an expanse of water, and that this world of the dead was kind of like in between the water underneath and the land. Again, we'll get into that in a few weeks, but I just wanted to explain what the netherworld meant. Okay, tattoos. Tattoos, when I was growing up, were not very popular, but now, if you're like under 40 and you don't have a tattoo, like something's wrong with you. Everybody has tattoos now. They are all over the place, super common. But in the Bible it says you're not supposed to wear a tattoo. So if you have a tattoo, you're in clear violation of Leviticus 19:28. You shall not make any cuts on your body for the dead or tattoo yourselves, for I am the Lord. So this one I think is pretty straightforward. We know why this is in the Bible. God was keeping his people from participating in the religious practices, again, of the neighboring Canaanites. They would slash their bodies and mark them with branding or ink for ritualistic purposes related to the worship of their gods. Tattooing and the marking of the body was a rite for honoring their gods and the dead. God was prohibiting worship practice related to false deities. Back then, 3,500 years ago, people didn't get tattoos like because of their girlfriend or whatever. People have a million reasons to wear tattoos. Their favorite sports team, or they just want a cool picture on their arm or whatever. Personal expression, basically, right? That's why people get tattoos now. But back then, that's not the reason people got tattoos. They got it because it had to do with their worship practices. It was a way to worship the gods that they were following. And so that's why it's prohibited in the Bible, is because God didn't want the Israelites following this religious practice of these surrounding people groups. And I think we could be pretty confident about this because we know from ancient documents that this practice was going on. Okay. Let me just, before we do that, let me just make one comment too about the pig and the football. So in the book, he points out that modern footballs are not made of pigskin. There is no pig in a modern football. The reason they were called pigskin, he says, is because back in the 1800s they would use a pig's bladder on the interior of the ball, and that's why they would call it a pigskin. But nowadays it's basically made of cowhide or some synthetic rubber or something. So in the book he talks about, I think it was The West Wing or some TV show where they made fun of Christians saying that, according to the Bible, you're not supposed to touch a football because it's pigskin, and it says in the Bible you're not supposed to touch a dead pig carcass. So that TV show was like triple misrepresenting the Bible, right? First of all, it's not understanding how we apply Old Testament verses to ourselves today. It was misinterpreting the verse, and he also didn't understand that footballs are not made out of pigskin. This is why it's very dangerous to get your Bible theology from TV shows. Okay. So, every time we read about God giving a strange instruction about refraining from something, a command that sounds bizarre to us, we need to remember that it wouldn't have sounded bizarre to the people at that time. Remember, we learned last week or the week before, the Bible was not written to us. It's for us, but it was not written to us. It was written to people that lived 3,500, at least these parts of the Bible, were written to people that lived 3,500 years ago. So to understand those books of the Bible, we have to try as hard as we can to put ourselves in the mindset of an Israelite living in 1400 BC. In that culture, how would they have understood these verses? That's how we have to try to understand these verses. These restrictions were common ways of identifying your ethnicity and religious affiliation. The restrictions may not make sense to us, but they were normal for the Israelites at that time in history. In other words, all of these verses that we find bizarre, the ancient Israelite would have been like, what's your problem? This is obvious. They would have understood all of these verses with no problem because they lived then. And we don't. We did not. So that's it for this week. Next week is extremely important. Try to be here if you can. We're going to talk about why do we follow some Old Testament commands but not others. I've been leading up to this I've been throwing hints out every week about this. But this is a very critical topic that the modern church is completely failing at and not explaining correctly to people. You know, I mentioned before, if you quote verses out of the Old Testament, you say, see, the Old Testament says this, therefore you have to do it, right? That is not right. Cannot do that. And so we're going to talk about why that is next week. But, you know, some of you who've read the Old Testament are thinking, well, but there's a lot of good stuff, right? There's the Ten Commandments. You know, are you saying throw the Ten Commandments out? Well, that's why you should come next week, because we'll talk about that.